The winter of 1951 hit Harlan County, Kentucky, like a freight train nobody had seen coming. By the second week of January, the temperature had dropped to 17 below zero, and the wind off the ridgeline was cutting through barn walls like a handsaw through green pine. Walter Cobb had been farming the same 112 acres his grandfather had broken with a mule team back in 1904, and in all his 43 years on that land, he had never once let the fireplace go cold between October and March. Not once. Because Walter knew something that most people driving through that hollow on the paved road above would never have guessed in 100 years. The ash from that fireplace was not waste. It was not something you shoveled out and forgot. It was one of the hardest working substances on the entire farm, and the morning he sat down at the kitchen table and told his son Dale exactly how to use it right, he was passing on knowledge that went back further than either of them could trace. Dale was 16 that winter, old enough to carry the ash bucket without being told, young enough to still ask why. And Walter had always believed the why was the most important part of any job a farm boy ever learned. You could train a mule to pull a plow without explaining a single thing. But you could not train a farmer that way. A farmer had to understand what the land was doing and why, what the cold was doing and why, what the fire was giving back and why. So that January morning, with the wind pressing against the kitchen window and the smell of his wife Edna's cornbread filling the room, Walter Cobb began to explain. The fireplace in that house burned primarily white oak and hickory, with occasional loads of locust when the other wood ran short. Those hardwoods produced an ash that was dense, pale gray and rich in potassium carbonate, a compound the old-timers simply called potash, though most of them would not have used that word in conversation. They knew what it did. They had learned it from their parents and their grandparents, who had learned it from people who had no other option but to figure it out or go without. And what it did was remarkable enough that once you understood it, you started to see ash not as the byproduct of burning wood, but as the actual point of burning wood, with heat as the pleasant bonus. Walter reached across the table and lifted the ash bucket, which Dale had hauled in from the fireplace that morning. It was about 3/4 full, the ash still holding a faint warmth, pale as a winter sky and finer than flour toward the bottom of the pile. He turned it slightly so Dale could see the color. The first thing potassium carbonate does, Walter said, is change the chemistry of whatever it touches. It is strongly alkaline, and that alkalinity is what makes it useful in more ways than most people ever stop to think about. He stood up from the table and carried the bucket toward the kitchen counter. And what happened in the next hour was less a lecture than a demonstration, the kind of teaching that sticks because your hands are in it from the beginning. Edna did not say much. She was already moving, the way farm women moved through their kitchens in the morning, purposeful and unhurried at the same time. Each motion connected to the next with no wasted steps. She reached past Walter for the small crock near the back of the counter, the one that had been her mother's. Glazed a dark brown with a chip out of the rim that Dale had caused at age 4 by pushing a cast-iron skillet off the shelf above it. She added a measured amount of cool, dry ash to the crock, poured a careful amount of water over it, and stirred without looking up from what she was doing. The reaction was not dramatic. There was a faint warmth where the ash hit the water, a slight fizzing at the surface. What resulted was a thin, milky liquid the family called lye water, considerably weaker than the concentrated solution used in soap making, and it was what Edna used to clean the wooden surfaces of the kitchen. She dipped a coarse cloth into the crock and began wiping down the kitchen table with it, the same table where the family ate every meal, where Dale had done his schoolwork for the past 10 years, where Walter spread his seed catalogs every February and marked what he planned to plant. Dale watched his mother work and did not immediately see what was different about it. He had watched her clean that table his entire life. Then Walter said, "Look at what she is actually doing to the wood. The alkaline solution in that cloth is not just wiping the surface, it is breaking down the fats and oils that have worked their way into the grain of the wood over years of meals, the residue that ordinary soap and water push around but do not lift out. It is converting those fats into a form that comes away clean when she rinses. It is doing the same work as soap, because it is what soap is made from before the fat gets added." Dale looked at the table. Walter said, "Put your hand on it after she rinses." Dale did. The surface was not just clean. It had a quality he could not have named, something between smooth and dry, Nothing tacky. Nothing slick. Just clean in the way that very old, well-maintained wood is clean when it has been treated correctly for a long time. Walter said, "That table has been washed with ash water since before your grandmother was born. Put your hand under the edge there and tell me if you feel any soft spots." Dale ran his fingers along the underside. Nothing. Solid as the day it was built. And it had been built from poplar planks that had been air-drying in the loft of the old barn when Walter's father was a boy. The alkalinity of the ash water had done something important over those decades of cleaning. It had kept the surface inhospitable to the mold and bacteria that break wood down, not because anyone had planned it that way, but because the chemistry worked out in their favor, without them ever needing to understand the chemistry. The table was the proof. 60 years old and not a soft spot anywhere. But the kitchen table was only the beginning. By mid-morning, with the temperature outside still brutal and the wind finding every gap in the farmhouse siding, Walter had pulled on his coat and told Dale to bring the ash bucket. They were going to the outhouse first and then to the henhouse, and by the time they were done, Dale was going to understand why every fireplace on a working farm was producing something more valuable than warmth. The outhouse sat 40 feet behind the main house, built from rough-cut boards that had weathered to silver gray, the interior worn smooth by use and by the particular patience that farm life applied to everything. Dale had always considered outhouse maintenance one of the worst chores on the farm, not the hardest, just the most consistently unpleasant. Walter did not argue with that, but he had a method, and the method had been wood ash. Every day after each use of the outhouse, someone in the family dropped a scoop of dry ash into the pit below. Walter had nailed a coffee can to the wall inside for exactly this purpose, and he kept it filled from the bucket on the same schedule he used for the henhouse and the garden. The scoop that went into the pit was not a large amount, but it was consistent, and consistency was the difference between a practice that worked and one that did not. What the ash did was attack the problem from 3 directions at once, which was the characteristic of good farm materials generally. They worked on more than one problem simultaneously, because a farmer never had the luxury of addressing one problem at a time. The ash raised the pH of the waste in the pit, which suppressed the ammonia production that was the primary source of the sharp smell an outhouse generated. The organisms that broke down organic waste and released ammonia as a byproduct were less active in a highly alkaline environment. This was not something Walter could have explained in those chemical terms. What he knew was what his nose told him every day. And what his nose told him was that the Cobb outhouse was tolerable in a way that other outhouses in the county were not. He was not shy about saying so. There were farms a mile in either direction where the outhouse was a genuine ordeal, where even in January the approach was an exercise in willpower, and the time spent inside was reduced to the absolute minimum. He had been inside Hal Fenton's outhouse once, helping Hal repair the roof after a storm in the fall of '49, and he had thought about his own outhouse with something close to gratitude for the rest of the day. Hal did not use ash. Hal used nothing. His outhouse smelled like what it was. The ash also worked on the flies, though that mattered more in warmer months. Flies sought out exactly the kind of environment an outhouse pit provided, laying eggs in large numbers, producing larvae that accelerated decomposition in ways that increased odor and created a population of insects that would eventually find their way 40 feet across the yard and into the kitchen. Highly alkaline conditions disrupted that cycle enough to make a measurable difference in the fly population around the outhouse, which translated into a measurable difference in the kitchen, which translated into a measurable difference in the health of everyone who ate from that kitchen. It was a chain of consequences, small at each link but significant at the end. And the ash extended the life of the pit itself by keeping conditions favorable for the anaerobic bacteria that did the actual work of reducing waste to stable, inert material. Outhouse pits managed with ash lasted longer before needing to be relocated, which mattered on a farm where moving an outhouse meant digging a new pit by hand and rebuilding the structure over it. That was 2 solid days of labor that could be stretched to 3 days, with bad luck or rocky ground. 3 days of labor that the ash had been quietly buying back, a scoop at a time, for decades. Dale had never thought about the outhouse as a system that could be managed. He had thought about it the way most 16-year-old boys thought about outhouses, which was to say he had tried not to think about it at all. He was beginning to see that this was a failure of attention that his father had just corrected. They crossed the yard to the hen house, moving fast because the cold was the kind that made your eyes water and your nose run simultaneously and discouraged any slow walking. The hen house was a low-board structure that Walter had built in '38, insulated with sawdust packed between the inner and outer walls, warm enough inside that the hens kept laying through the worst of January, provided they had enough feed and light. There were 42 birds in there that winter, Rhode Island Reds and Barred Rocks mostly, reliable winter layers if you kept them healthy. And keeping them healthy in close quarters through the cold months was the central challenge of winter poultry management. The problem was parasites. Mites and lice moved through a flock in confined winter quarters with a speed that had to be seen to be believed. Dale had seen it once on a visit to a neighbor's farm when he was 12. A flock that had gone from apparently healthy to visibly distressed in the space of 3 weeks. The birds pecking at themselves constantly, egg production dropping, 2 of them dead before the family identified the cause. The neighbor had treated with a commercial powder that the feed store in town carried, and it had worked, but it had cost money, and it had not prevented the problem from recurring the following winter. Walter had not had a serious mite problem in the Cobb flock in over 10 years. The reason was built into the corner of the hen house, a low wooden box about 3 feet square that Walter had constructed when he built the structure, which he kept filled with dry wood ash from the house fireplace. The hens used it every day. Dale had watched them do it his whole life without thinking about what he was watching. The birds would settle into the ash box, ruffle their feathers down to the skin, and work the fine powder into every part of their plumage, using their beaks and feet, and the particular twisting motion chickens used in dust baths, ancient and unhurried, and apparently deeply satisfying to the bird doing it. Walter grabbed the lip of the box and showed Dale the depth of the ash, about 4 inches of fine pale powder, and then reached in and lifted a handful and let it sift through his fingers. "This fine," he said. "See how fine it gets toward the bottom. That is what gets down under the feathers to where the mites live. The ash particles work their way into the spaces where a mite wants to breed, and they make those spaces uninhabitable. The alkalinity is caustic to the soft bodies of insects at that kind of close contact, and the mites that try to set up in a bird that dusts itself in ash regularly are fighting a losing battle." Dale added a fresh layer from the bucket, and the hens that had been waiting at the edge of the box moved in before he had taken his hand away. Walter said, "You see that? They know what it does better than we do. They have been doing this longer than we have been farming. The wild ancestors of these birds used volcanic ash and dry dirt for the same purpose. We just figured out how to give them the best version of what they were already looking for. A flock with regular access to a good ash dust bath carried a parasite load low enough that it showed up in the eggs. Production through the winter months was measurably better, and production was money. Edna sold eggs to the general store in Wallins Creek every Friday morning, carrying them in the wooden crate that lived on the floor of the truck cab, and the income was small but consistent, and consistency mattered enormously in a household where most income came in large seasonal lumps at harvest time. The egg money bought flour and sugar and the things the farm did not produce, and it came in every Friday without fail, and it came in because the flock stayed healthy, and the flock stayed healthy because of the ash box in the corner of the hen house that Walter had built in 1938 and had been filling from the fireplace ever since. They walked back to the house with their heads down against the wind, and Edna had coffee on the stove and a plate of cornbread squares on the table. The 3 of them sat down without ceremony, the way farm families sat down to midday food in the middle of a working day, purposefully and briefly, fueling up rather than dining. After a few minutes of silence, Dale said, "So the fire heats the house and the ash does everything else." Walter looked at him over his coffee cup. He said, "Now you are starting to think about it right." What he meant was this: the fireplace was not a single-purpose tool. It was a system, and the ash was not the waste product of the system. It was one of the outputs, as deliberate in its way as the heat, once you understood how to use it. A farm that understood this got more from its firewood than a farm that did not. It got a cleaning agent, a pest deterrent, a soil amendment, a soap-making ingredient, and a sanitation tool, all from the same material it was already producing every day just by staying warm. That February, Edna spent a Saturday making lye soap, a project that came around twice a year and occupied most of the daylight hours. She had been saving fat since October, bacon grease and beef tallow from the November butchering, accumulated in a covered crock in the cold cellar, and she had been setting aside the palest, finest ash from the fireplace in the wooden box that had been her mother's, kept covered and dry in the equipment shed where the weather could not reach it. Dale watched the whole process that day, which he had seen before but never paid attention to the way he was paying attention now. The ash went into the wooden leaching barrel that sat on a stand outside the kitchen door, a barrel his father had built with a layer of straw and gravel at the base to filter what came through. Edna poured rainwater she had collected from the barrel under the eave slowly over the ash, a little at a time, and then they waited. What came out of the spigot at the bottom of the barrel, slowly and in a thin, dark stream over the course of several hours, was lye water. Not the thin, diluted solution Edna used for cleaning the kitchen. This was concentrated lye, strong enough to blister skin if it sat on it, strong enough to saponify fat and turn it into soap. Edna tested it the way her mother had tested it, floating a fresh egg in a small bowl of the lye water and watching where it sat. The egg should show a circle about the size of a quarter above the surface. Too small, and the lye was too weak. The soap would not harden properly. Too much of the egg above the surface and the lye was too concentrated. The finished soap would be harsh and crumbly and hard on skin. She adjusted without measuring, adding a little more water to the barrel to weaken the lye slightly, running a second test, nodding. Dale asked her how she knew how much to adjust, and she said, "You do it enough times, you stop thinking about it as adjusting. You just know." He understood that this was not a satisfying answer for a 16-year-old, but he also understood that it was the only accurate one. The fat went into the large iron kettle outside, the one that lived year-round on the stones Walter had set for it behind the kitchen garden, used for soap making and for scalding hogs at butchering time and for boiling laundry in the worst of the winter mud season. The fire under it was built carefully, not too hot, because the saponification reaction that turned fat and lye into soap was exothermic on its own, and a fire that was too aggressive could cause the batch to seize up or separate. Edna added the lye water to the fat in a slow, steady pour, stirring constantly with a long wooden paddle that was black from decades of contact with the caustic mixture. The transformation took time. The mixture went from clear fat and milky lye water to something opaque and thickening, changing color as the saponification proceeded, moving toward the warm tan that was the finished soap's color. Dale stirred when Edna needed a rest, the paddle heavy in the thick mixture, the fumes from the lye reaction keeping him at arm's length as much as possible. When the mixture reached what Edna called trace, the stage where drops from the paddle left a brief pattern on the surface before sinking back in, she called Walter over to help ladle it into the wooden molds. The molds were pieces of scrap lumber nailed into shallow rectangular boxes and greased with a thin coat of lard to prevent sticking. The soap would sit in them for 2 days, then be turned out and cut into bars with a wire, then stacked on the shelf in the back room to cure for 6 weeks minimum. Fully cured soap was harder, milder, and longer lasting than soap used too soon, and Edna was not a woman who used soap too soon. Dale looked at the molds sitting on the table in the back room that evening, the soap still soft and smelling of the fat and faintly of smoke. He thought about where it had come from. Hickory and white oak burning in the fireplace, ash from that burning, water from the rain barrel through the ash, pulling out the potassium carbonate, producing the lye. Lye combined with the fat that the hogs and cattle had laid down over the summer, rendered and stored. The soap was the farm's own production from beginning to end, and it would clean the family's hands and clothes and dishes for months, bought at no cash cost beyond the time to make it. He thought about what his father had said. Now, you are starting to think about it right. March arrived hard and left slowly, which was its habit in eastern Kentucky. The snow on the north slopes held into the second week of April, and the fields stayed too wet to work longer than Walter liked. He and Dale used the time for maintenance, repointing the stone foundation of the smokehouse, repairing the split-rail fence along the lower pasture, rebuilding the corner post at the garden gate that had heaved in the frost and was leaning at an angle that would pull the whole gate out of true by summer if left alone. When Edna's calendar said the beds were ready, The ash came out of the wooden storage box in the equipment shed, dry and pale grey, all of winter's accumulation waiting for the garden. Walter spread it carefully, more carefully than neighbouring farms that scattered it without thought. He knew from decades of watching the same ground that too much ash could push the soil pH high enough that certain nutrients became unavailable to plants even if they were physically present in the soil. The potatoes got no ash at all. Blueberries needed acid ground and ash would ruin them. The tomatoes and beans and the brassicas got a moderate application, broadcast evenly, and worked in with a fork before the transplants went in. He used no instrument to measure any of this. He had no soil testing kit, though he knew the Harlan County Extension Office would run a test for a small fee if he wanted one. He read the soil with his hands and his memory, which went back to watching his own father farm the same ground and forward through his own 30 years of growing things in it. He knew which beds had been amended the previous season and which needed more. He knew where the soil ran naturally acidic and where it was closer to neutral. He knew the color and smell and feel of it in his fingers, the way a man knows the feel of his own tools. Edna followed behind him with the transplants, setting tomatoes and cabbage starts into the prepared beds, and around each new plant, she laid a careful circle of dry ash on the soil surface. Not a heavy ring, just enough to discourage what she had come to think of as the tax the slugs collected on every spring planting. Slugs avoided crossing a dry ash barrier because the alkalinity was caustic to their soft bodies. After a rain, it had to be renewed, but in the dry spells of April and May, it held, and her transplant survival rate in the ash-ringed beds was consistently better than in the beds where she had not gotten to the ash yet. By late May, the garden was telling its story the way gardens do, in the color of the leaves and the thickness of the stems, and the speed with which the plants were putting on growth. The tomatoes looked strong from the beginning, the stems dark green and sturdy, the first flower clusters forming earlier than the previous year. The cabbage starts that would have been half gone to slugs in a wet spring were standing intact in their rows. Dale walked the beds with Edna one evening before supper, and she pointed out each thing without making a speech about it. This one is doing well. That row is ahead of last year. These here have not lost a plant. She did not say the word ash. She did not need to. Summer came on hot and well-watered, good-growing weather, and the garden responded the way good ground responds to good conditions, abundantly and without drama. By August, Edna was putting up tomatoes at a pace that filled the cellar shelf by shelf, quart jars of whole tomatoes and pints of juice and stewed tomatoes with onion and pepper, 47 quart jars before the plants slowed, more than she had put up in several years. She worked the canning operation the way she worked everything, methodically and without wasted motion, the pressure canner hissing on the stove, the jars cooling on the counter in rows, the gold rings of the lid bands catching the afternoon light through the kitchen window. Dale helped with the canning that August, the way he helped with most things, where he was needed and without being asked twice. He carried jars up from the cellar and down again, kept the fire under the canner at the right temperature, washed lids and checked seals. One afternoon while they were working, he said to Edna, "The ash did this." She looked at him. She said, "The ash and the weather and the work did this." He said, "Yes, Mum." But he was right, and she knew he was right, and she gave him a look that acknowledged it before she turned back to the stove. The fall of 1951 came in cool and clear, the kind of fall that eastern Kentucky sometimes produced between the brutality of the summer heat and the brutality of the winter cold, and the Cobb farm moved through the harvest season with the efficiency of a household that had done this work many times and knew the rhythm of it. The potatoes came in, the corn came in, the dried beans were shelled and stored, the last of the tomatoes were put up. The hogs were butchered in November when the temperature dropped reliably below freezing and stayed there, the meat smoked and salted and stored in the smokehouse, the fat rendered into lard and tallow saved for cooking and for Edna's next soap making. The fireplace was lit for the season in the second week of October. By the end of the month, the ash bucket was full again, and Dale took it to the henhouse without being told, and added a scoop to the outhouse, and brought a portion inside to Edna for the cleaning crock. The cycle was running again. It had never really stopped. That winter, Dale sat across from his father at the kitchen table on a Saturday afternoon, and they talked about the farm. The way the two of them had begun to talk about it over the past year, not as father instructing son, but as two men thinking through the same problems together. Dale said he had been thinking about the ash use as a single connected system, how the fireplace fed everything else, how nothing in it was wasted. Walter listened and then said, "That is right." And then he said something that Dale would carry for the rest of his life. He said, "The mistake people make is they look at what a thing is called and think they know what it does. Ash is what you call it. What it is something else entirely. What it is depends on what you do with it. You look at what it actually does, not what the name says it is. That is how you figure out what anything is worth." The years moved through the 1950s, and the farm changed at its own pace, which was slower than some farms and faster than others. Walter put in propane in '54 for the cook stove, which Edna accepted with something that looked like relief, even though she had never complained about the wood. A bathroom went in during '56, an addition built off the back bedroom, and the outhouse was retired, though not demolished, because Walter did not remove a structure until he was certain it would never be needed again, which on a farm meant you were almost never certain. The fireplace kept burning, the henhouse ash box stayed full, the garden got its ash in the spring. Edna gave up the lye soap making somewhere around '58, when the combination of a bathroom, a better stove, and affordable commercial soap made the all-day Saturday project feel like more than the situation required. But she kept the ash water on the kitchen surfaces. She kept the ash rings around her transplants. The core practice held even as the perimeter changed, the way the essential parts of a farm hold, while the optional parts shift with the times. Dale married in '57, a girl from Bell County named Ruth, who had grown up on a tobacco and cattle operation, and who arrived at the Cobb farm with her own knowledge of ash use that in some respects covered ground Edna had not. Ruth's mother had been raised by a woman who came of age before 1910, and some of that very old knowledge had made it through intact. Ruth used a thin paste of ash and water to clean rust from cast iron cookware, working it in with a rough cloth and rinsing it away without damaging the seasoning. She scattered dry ash over fresh grease spills on the wooden kitchen floor, let it sit to absorb the grease, then swept it up before mopping, which was faster and more effective than trying to mop fresh grease directly. Walter watched her do this the first time and nodded without saying anything, the way he acknowledged things that confirmed what he already knew about how the world worked. By the time Walter's health began to slow him down in the mid-1960s, Dale had been running the daily operation for several years. He had made changes where they made sense and held to practice where it worked. The fireplace in the main house still burned from October to March. The ash still came out of it in the same battered bucket, painted gray by decades of contact with its contents, that Walter had used when Dale was a boy. Dale had never thought to replace it. In January of 1967, with ice on the roads and 12 below zero on the thermometer, and young Walter, age 7, following his father through the morning chores with the careful attention of a boy who senses he is being taught something important without yet knowing what it is, Dale Cobb carried the ash bucket into the kitchen and set it on the floor near the table. He pulled out a chair and told his son to sit down. He said, "I want to tell you about what comes out of that fireplace because it is not what you think it is." The boy sat. Outside, the wind was pressing against the window glass the same way it had pressed against it 16 years earlier, on the January morning when Dale had sat in that same chair and listened to his own father say something close to those same words. The cornbread smell was the same. The cold outside was the same. The pale grey ash in the bucket was the same. Dale reached into the bucket and let a handful of the fine ash sift through his fingers back into the pile, the way Walter had done it, the way his grandfather had done it before that, all the way back to the people who had first understood that a fireplace produces two things worth having, and one of them is not the one most people think about. He began to explain. The why was the most important part. It always had been. If this look into the way American farm families turned the simplest things into something extraordinary meant something to you today, please subscribe to this channel and hit the like button before you go. Share this video with someone who remembers this kind of life, or who ought to know about it. There are more stories here, and we will see you in the next one. This video is inspired by real historical practices, documented agricultural traditions, and the everyday ingenuity of American farm families from the 1930s through the 1970s. It is intended for educational and entertainment purposes only and does not seek to represent or offend any individual, family, or community. Dale Cobb is a representative character who reflects the real experiences of hundreds of American farmers who lived and worked exactly this way during this era, passing hard-earned practical knowledge from one generation to the next on small farms across Kentucky and throughout rural America.